All right, so it's been a few months since we've made any updates on the shop truck project, and we've just been really busy with customer vehicles, and it got kind of pushed off to the back burner. But now we are pulling in the frame and we are gonna build it. So we got a new frame from Rovers North, and it's the same type of frame as it had originally. It's a military spec frame with the reinforcements, and you can see the gussets on the rear cross member there. So yeah, Mike's just getting it pulled out, and we're gonna get it in the shop and begin assembling it. The engine has been rebuilt, and we got that all assembled, and we actually ended up getting a new bulkhead for this one from Rovers North. The bulkhead was really beyond repair after we had it sandblasted. It was questionable to begin with, but I figured, you know, let's give it a shot and see if maybe we could save it, but it wasn't savable. So we got a new galvanized bulkhead from Rovers North, and actually Nick is just sanding that out right now back here, getting that ready. So we're gonna go with this bulkhead because it's galvanized. So the bulkheads that we've tried galvanizing in the past have always warped, and we stopped offering that service because of the really bad warping on the bulkhead. But this one from Rovers North is galvanized and primed and pretty much ready to go, besides making a few alterations to it. So I'm pretty excited. We got the axles sandblasted and ready to go. They're just pulling in the frame now. So we'll see how it goes. I'm really excited to get the truck going and potentially have it ready before winter, because it'll be used for plowing and all sorts of other utilitarian purposes. Okay, the frame for the shop truck is officially in, and you can see this is a big difference over the one that it replaced. The old one didn't look terrible at first, but I did have Mike cut it open on the side just so we could take a look in, because there was a little bit of rot coming through. So we figured we'd cut a little piece out and take a look in, and what I saw was not good. The whole thing was rotting from the inside out. And that's why I recommend, if you're looking at buying a truck with an original frame that hasn't been replaced with a galvanized frame, maybe even send a bore scope into the frame just to look at how bad it is. It's really, buying any truck with an original frame or restoring a truck that has an original frame that you want to keep is really kind of like Russian roulette. And you see stuff like door gaps that are tapered and doors that don't close properly and stuff like that. It could be an indication of it, but at the minimum, really look these frames over, because almost every one we see is rotted to some extent. Typically, we're replacing every single one with a galvanized frame. I mean, why take a chance with something that's over 50 years old when you could have something that's all new metal? It all has to be taken apart anyway. You might as well just invest that extra little bit of money in a new frame. Okay, and we're using Rovers North parabolic springs on here, and the military frames had a little bit higher ride height than the civilian frame. So you can see there's actually two holes down here, and because we're using parabolics, we're actually going with the upper hole, and we're using civilian shackles. So the military frames would have these longer shackles, and the springs would be positioned in this hole, but we don't want to have too much lift because the drive shaft angles will be all wrong. Plus there's no real advantage to going that much higher. We're still going to use the stock 750/16 tires. So we're using parabolic springs, which have a little bit of lift themselves, but we're going to the lower ride height position of the civilian truck. So it'll even out and be about the same as what a normal military truck would have for ride height. Okay, so Mike's fishing the wiring harness through, so you can see he has this stiff wire, and if he's lucky, he'll get it through the frame without catching on any sort of welded in tubes. And the goal is to get it right up to there and then pull the wire out, and then we can attach the harness to the wire. So here's our new wiring harness, and we'll just pull it right through the frame and pop a grommet on the hole there.
So to tie the harness to it and drag the harness through, hopefully that goes easy as it goes from the front like that. So we're using anti-seize on the bolts to prevent any type of seizing inside the bushing tube.
Like rusting, like if moisture gets in there so the bolts don't rust to the tube.
Exactly.
So you got the front ones on. That looks good. There you go.
There we go, this side's on.
All right, so we made pretty good progress here, and the day's over, but we got the axles mounted in the frame. And so starting with the back axle, you probably saw the guys installing what looked like a complete axle. Well, that's how we have the axle sandblasted. We leave the original diff in and the hubs. That way it's sealed up and we can sandblast the outside of the axle without the risk of sand getting inside. But once it's mounted, we pull that original diff out and we're gonna use a new rebuilt diff. And in this case, we're going with 24 spline axles, and I'm actually trying a different gear ratio this time. So these are 375:1 ring and pinions from Ashcroft. So what I'm testing out here is a higher gear ratio. The original gear ratio was 470, and this is 375. So why would you want to go to a higher gear ratio? Well, these trucks didn't have a very high top speed originally. Really 50 miles an hour was kind of your cruising speed. So I'm actually going to try to keep this truck as simple as possible. And I'm going to go with a Series 3 fully synchronized 4-speed, but I'm not going to go with an overdrive like we do on our other trucks. I'm going to try just using a slightly higher gear ratio and see if will kind of split the difference and make the vehicle more usable than a non-overdrive truck. But yet I avoid the extra complexity of having the overdrive. So it's just a test. I could always switch it to a 5-speed later on or add an overdrive, but I'd like to just try out this gear set and see if it's a nice, well-rounded gear ratio for the vehicle. The vehicles are usually geared so low that you can start off in second most of the time anyway, as long as you're not on a hill. So this gear set will not give me quite the same ratio as a overdrive that's engaged. It still will not have the cruising speed that a vehicle with an overdrive will, but since it's a heavier vehicle, it's not going to have the horsepower to pull it up hills at 60, 65 anyway. So I mentioned before, it's a 24 spline diff. Well, that's to fit these 24 spline Ashcroft heavy duty series axles. So these are some half shafts from Ashcroft that have the late Series 3 splines on this side, like the 80, 81, 82 Series 3 splines on this side, so you could use late Series 3 drive flanges, and it has the Defender 24 splines on that side. So it's a completely unique half shaft made by Ashcroft. And if there's one thing that I could recommend doing on a 109, it's putting in these 24 spline heavy duty half shafts, because the rear half shafts were a major weak point even on 88s, and a 109 has a lot more weight. And if you snap a half shaft, which happens quite a bit, you could potentially do catastrophic damage to your differential or to your hub. I've seen half shaft snap just on 109s, just pulling away from a stop sign. That's one thing we do not want to do. Also, the ring and pinion are actually a heavy duty design. The front diff is also the new heavy duty ring and pinion as well, because a lot of times with the front diffs, you have locking hubs and the front diff really never gets used, and you have this layer of water or moisture on top of the level of the oil, and the ring and pinions get really bad pitting right there. So bad that they're oftentimes not usable. So it just pays to go with the new diff as well. And of course, being 375:1 ratio, we have to do the front diff with those Ashcroft gears as well. So like I mentioned, we put the axle in, and then we start kind of rebuilding it while it's in the frame. So that means taking off the spindles. We put new seal races on those. Those get right stuffed to the housing, so we don't use the paper gaskets, and we use these new grade 8 bolts here. And you can see everything's marked with a paint pen because we want to torque everything and mark it with a paint pen so that we know 100% everything's tight. The hubs are actually Series 3, so we're not using the Series 2A hubs because they have this horrible design of thread-in studs that are simply peened over to keep them from coming out. And they always come out when you go to zip your lug nuts off because the lug nuts are rusted to the studs and they just easily unthread from the hubs, and you have a hub with no studs in it, kind of like an Audi or Volkswagen. And we use the Series 3 hubs because we're going with disc brakes on the front, and those hubs use Series 3 studs. So we want uniformity with the lug nuts front to back. We don't want to use early style hubs in the back, which use a different lug nut, and Series 3 hubs in the front, because that mismatch would just be a little bit annoying when you go to change your tires and stuff like that, rotate your tires, stuff like that. And it's just nice to have uniformity. And the Series 3 hub is a much more robust design with the press-in spline studs instead of the threaded type. So you could see we got the late Series 3 drive flange. It has these heavy-duty axles. The diff is in with, we use the gasket, but we also use right stuff here, so it actually seals. You could see all of the nuts have been marked with a paint pen, so we know that they're torqued. And we also have galvanized spring plates and galvanized brake line plates. So we want to really try to protect the bottom of this truck because with all the road salt, it just eats these parts up. So anything that can be galvanized, we're typically just going ahead and doing that. Same thing with the front. You can see the galvanized spring plates there. So the next step will be we're going to rebuild the swivels and install those to the front axle, and we're going to mount up some Michelin XZL tires in 750/16 to some late Defender 16-inch wheels, 16 by 5.5. They look like the series wheels, but they're designed for tubeless tires, so you don't have to have inner tubes, which are a huge pain. So we'll get those mounted up, and soon we'll have a rolling chassis, and it's time to drop in the motor, which happens to be right here, waiting to go in. So, and a few goodies arrived from Rovers North. We have a 2-inch receiver hitch to go on the back so that I can tow a small trailer. The original military trucks had the pintle hitch, but this will just be much more useful. So, you know, sometimes function wins out over originality, but most of the times we're going to try to keep things, we're not going to want to do any modifications that aren't reversible. So at some point, if I wanted to add the original NATO pintle hitch, I could just unbolt that and add it. So it's going to get pretty exciting because once we have the motor in and the transmission, we're going to put the body on, and we'll get to see what the truck's going to look like. And keep in mind, this is not going to be a restored truck, so it's not going to look as beautiful as that. But like with anything else, our mantra is always, we want to put back as many Land Rovers on the road as possible, and we want to build them so that they last. And to do that, you can't always say, well, every Land Rover has to be perfect. They don't. They all have to be mechanically perfect because that's a safety issue, but sometimes the cosmetics are fine to leave alone, and that's what we call our patina restorations. And that's exactly what this vehicle will be. So mechanically, it will be perfect. New wiring, new brake lines, everything will be new, but we'll leave the body panels in a more kind of rugged, original look, which I think will be well suited for the shop truck.